Welcome back to the Lit Hit. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. That is the aphorism Wilfred Owen lambasts at the close of his poem Dulce et Decorum est. He writes, "If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori." So is it a lie, the notion of military honour? Is it, as Owen suggests, a way of glorifying acts of incomprehensible agony, glossing over the surface of something inherently dirty? His depiction of war in Dulce et Decorum est, and indeed in Exposure, another of his poems, is one of horrific psychological and physical toil. He calls this claim of glory the old lie. Similarly, Exposure is quite evidently a denunciation of war in all its meaninglessness and futility. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? But the charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson is less clearly interpreted. Is it simply a reinforcement of that old jingoistic lie? Is Tennyson just sticking to the party line? He was poet laureate after all, which meant he was required to turn out appropriate but often uninspired verse. He had to do what Queen Victoria told him to, basically. At the beginning of the 20th century, the image of military sacrifice did a U-turn of sorts. In the Battle of the Somme, hundreds of thousands of soldiers died, and the poets of the First World War saw nothing heroic about that. While Tennyson wrote, "Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die," Rudyard Kipling satirised the poem with, "If any ask why we died, tell them because our fathers lied." It's a cutting rebuke of Tennyson's apparent glorification of war, that patriotic marching anthem as it is often interpreted. But as always, we're here to think about debates like this carefully and to consider all of the alternative opinions available to us. Our title today is all about this topic. Are soldiers' deaths meaningless, or are they to be heralded as warrior heroes? Jingoistic just means excessively patriotic, even nationalistic, and this is often the accusation levelled against Tennyson for his poem. We'll follow this plan. We'll spend the first part of this video focusing on how the charge of the Light Brigade can be interpreted as a patriotic tribute. Second, we will examine the alternative view that the poem is a bleak epitaph to a false heroism. Third, we will unpack Exposure and think about how it too is a dirge lamenting the hopelessness and meaninglessness of war. Finally, we'll consider how these two poems might fit together in the context of an exam comparison. You'll need a copy of the poem in front of you as we go through this. Print it off or get it up on another tab. First then, the charge of the Light Brigade as a patriotic tribute. The Light Brigade were, as the name suggests, lightly equipped, with no heavy weaponry. Picture the scene, deep in a dusty valley and over enemy lines. It's the Battle of Balaklava on the 25th of October, 1854. The Light Brigade has sent a mistaken or miscommunicated command to charge. Tennyson alludes to this in his poem when he writes, "Someone had blundered." They were sent in with no chance of victory. Surrounded on all sides by Russians with heavy artillery, they were soon forced to retreat, vastly depleted in number. Lord Raglan was the culprit. Can you see that orange line in the centre of the diagram? That's the Light Brigade in their initial attack and subsequent retreat. They were met with an onslaught of Russian shells as they stampeded hopelessly into the valley. Well, enough of the history. How does Tennyson create something supposedly patriotic out of that? There are many examples in the poem of the soldiers' unwavering loyalty and bravery. We don't have time to look at them in detail, so I'm going to choose 3 of my favourites and explain them in depth. Remember, this is by no means a comprehensive analysis. There is so much more you can get from the poem. First, the contrast of obedience with reality exaggerates the soldier's sacrifice. We see this most clearly through Tennyson's use of repetition throughout. The refrain of "rode the 600" at the end of each of the first few stanzas provides the reader with a security that these are loyal soldiers who will press on despite what they're up against. The repetition in the second stanza of "there's not to, there's not to, there's but to" is a specific type of repetition called anaphora, where the start of each line begins with the same words. It creates a regimental effect in which we can almost envisage the obedience of each soldier standing in line as they await the command to charge. In stark contrast, that's a helpful phrase by the way, stark contrast. It's better than just contrast because it shows that you understand how much of a contrast is created. And it is a stark contrast when in the following stanza Tennyson utilises the same technique to paint a picture of the unrelenting assault, with enemies surrounding the soldiers on all sides. The use of anaphora to create a sense of the all-encompassing brutal reality of devastating weaponry could be a purposeful attempt to echo that obedience we see in the previous stanza. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them. There are so many more examples of where Tennyson demonstrates the soldier's bravery alongside the gravity of the situation. Why not try to find some yourself and annotate your copy of the poem? Second, the use of vivid religious imagery accentuates the soldier's nobility. Tennyson personifies death and hell with the human features, jaw and mouth, creating a harrowing image of the landscape and opposition army as a monstrous being. We're led to assume that they are confronting the forces of evil head on. They're almost depicted as martyrs, dying for a noble cause. Earlier he writes, "all in the valley of death," which links to Psalm 23 in the Bible, "even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." It gives the event eternal significance. They have an eternal legacy. Bizarrely, this might even have been comforting for a Victorian audience. The next line is, "I will fear no evil," in the psalm that is. These soldiers are set up as brave on an almost transcendent level. Third, the final stanza, in all its rhetoric, showers the soldiers in tribute after tribute. Have you noticed all of the persuasive devices Tennyson uses? The dramatic "oh" cries of a rousing political speech, the repetition of honour, and the overly respectful language of noble, glory and honour. But, and I will stray into the next section of the video here, listen to the w sound, the consonants Tennyson uses through these lines. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. It's an audible lament, a wail of grief, despite the facade of honour and nobility. Is it just a patriotic, jingoistic lie? Well, let's have a look at that now, as we head into our next section. We'll consider whether the charge of the Light Brigade is just a bleak epitaph to a false heroism. First, Tennyson uses unspecific language to portray the unknown blunder and the unknown soldier. Well, this is clear on a number of occasions in the poem. Think the 600 and the Light Brigade and he said and someone had blundered. There's no scapegoating of the idiot who gave the command, but nor are there names for the 600. Reasonable, I suppose, given there were 600 of them, and Tennyson does use language like noble and glory to describe them. But the anonymity of the soldiers and the fact that Tennyson doesn't name the blunderer shows how farcical the error was. And although Tennyson asks, when can their glory fade? It already has, really, because we don't know any of their names. They're lost to the history books and the GCSE Power and Conflict Poetry Anthology. What could just as easily be seen as a homogeneous brigade of men, united by their honour, could be perceived as a tragic depiction of the unknown soldier, merely a unit in the midst of vast numbers at the general's disposal. Second, the shocked stutter of "not" in the fourth stanza could be seen as tearful bewilderment on the part of Tennyson in the face of a futile sacrifice. Tennyson has just used violent verbs and evidently intentional sibilants in "reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered," to vocalise the soldiers' skill in fighting the Russians in one-to-one combat. But it's followed by, "then they rode back, but not the 600. The knot almost catches in the throat as a whimper of sorts. It emphasises the break from that continuous refrain of "Rode the 600", which had so far in the poem continued on, perturbed but determined. Is this an emotional confusion, raising the question of why the soldiers, in all their skill and bravery, were sent in on a hopeless mission? Look at those words, shattered and sundered again. They both end with the same sound. A sound, if isolated, is simply the word "erd", meaning mistaken. Finally, the weather is used to highlight the meaninglessness of the conflict and the hopelessness in the soldiers' attempts to fight. We see this in the penultimate stanza, where Tennyson writes, "volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell." These are verbs in the semantic field of weather, thundered and stormed, to show the power of the army they were up against and the futility of their attempts to battle it. Who would fight thunder? This seems an appropriate time to have a look at Owen's Exposure, given that it too uses the weather to highlight the meaninglessness of the soldiers' sacrifice. We're just going to focus on one part. While Tennyson reports on the action of the Battle of Balaklava from a distance, Owen is very much in the midst of the situation. The personal pronouns give us an immediate sense of his personal struggle in the conflict. But whilst in the Charge of the Light Brigade we're given a sense of the immensity and weakness of human power in war, here the focus is on the weather to show how futile the soldiers' pain and suffering really was. The harrowing first line of the play is where our focus will be. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. The emphasis is placed on psychological torture. Although the weather is very much a tangible force that the soldiers are struggling with, it's also a metaphor for the mental torment that comes with being helpless. What are we doing here, they say. How helpless are they? Well, the weather as a personified murderer shows that the soldiers are entirely under its power. Their battle is not one of victorious, bloody bravery as they stand up against enemy forces. No, they're left to languish in a desolate pit of misery as they rot away under the biting wind. Notice the sibilance in this line, the s sound that runs through it like the wind. We hear it as we read, run it through our brains. Perhaps not in the same aching way that Owen experienced, but at least we get a sense of their feeling that their sacrifice is pointless. So finally, let's briefly have a think about how the two poems might fit together in an exam scenario. Compare how the poets present ideas about the effects of conflict in The Charge of the Light Brigade and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. Well, we've been thinking about this topic of the old jingoistic lie. Is dying in battle a noble act? I think that should be the main thrust of any comparison between these two poems. Think about their differing perspectives on war. Remember, when you're comparing, you can think about thematic differences and similarities, but also similarities and differences in technique, i.e. have they both used sibilants to create the same effect? It's about finding subtle differences and similarities that will show you've really thought about the poem. They do both use sibilants, but to create different effects. Have a think now about how you would write about it in an exam context. Why not even try drafting a paragraph? If you like this video, please subscribe below.